Hi everybody, my name is Eimear Manning. It's an Irish name with way too many letters, but it's pronounced Eimear. And I'm from the National Youth Council of Ireland, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the climate crisis into climate justice. I'm going to get over the boring slide first, which is introducing you to who the National Youth Council actually is. So NYCI is the representative body for voluntary youth organisations in Ireland. So long story short, we're a member organisation. So voluntary youth sectors will sign up to be a member of the NYCI. And we work with our members and with nearly 400,000 young people across Ireland and internationally per year. And we use our collective expertise to act on issues that impact young people, particularly on areas of policy. So, one of the biggest issues that we're having at the moment, all across Europe and the broader world, is this idea of disinformation, of misinformation, and of just general anger, fear, and of course that kind of lean to some far-right etiquette that is happening at the moment. We've seen protests in Greece, in Italy, in the UK, and even in my own country of Ireland, with the current refugee crisis fueling the fire. I'm going to come back a little bit about this later on, but when you see these pictures, you probably have your own thoughts in your mind about these kinds of people, and you probably have an idea of the demographic in your head that makes up these kinds of people, and all of the pictures that I could find from these protests were all young white men. But we actually did some research in Ireland with an organisation called the Hope and Courage Collective, and they try to look at recruitment methods for far-right activists. How do they try to get people to join the far-right? And what they found was that the current messaging, particularly around people who are immigrating into different countries, is all about undocumented males. It's all about the fear surrounding that. And actually, the biggest cohort of people that are joining the far-right movement because of that messaging is young women between the ages of 18 and 30. And it's typically because those young women are from lower socioeconomic areas who typically have experienced some sort of violence at the hand of men and therefore are being recruited to these groups. So that's the first misconception that we have. It's actually not all young white men. We are seeing a huge increase of young white women. But the second is that there's the rise of the far-right environmentalist, which you might not have heard of before, and it might cause some eyebrows going, what? But this is a really old concept, and it actually dates back to when basically the Nazis actually invented this concept. And it's called eco-bordering. And essentially what these far-right activists are trying to say is that if somebody from a different country comes over to our country, they're not going to have the respect for the environment that somebody who is native and local to that area has. Therefore, we're actually putting our environment at risk by bringing in immigrants. So they're trying to set the scene for closing off our borders for environmental purposes. And this is going to be a new trend that hasn't really taken hold a ton yet, but I can guarantee you that from our research with the Hope and Courage Collective, it is on the rise. So do keep an eye out for it when looking at that kind of issue around the far right. Now, the big issue that we have here with regards to climate change and the far right and this misinformation, disinformation, and the rise of eco-bordering is that, as you can see from this graph, this shows the different migrations of environments and habitats as climate change worsens. So you can see that the environment and the habitats don't really shift closer to the equator, but if you look around Europe and Russia and the United States, North America and Canada, there's a massive shift of environments. That's going to be detrimental for a few reasons. The first is there's going to be a mass migration of all species. That doesn't just mean animals, it also means humans, in order to try and escape the worst negative impacts of climate change. The next is disease spread. COVID-19, as we know, was caused by a bat that bit a pangolin. The pangolin is the most trafficked animal in the world, and then somebody ate that pangolin. And then that caused COVID-19 by one person eating one animal. So the more of these migrations that we have, where humans and animals are going to move alongside each other and are going to be pushed into tighter and tighter spaces together, the more risk we have of more disease spread and further pandemics. The next is obviously going to be conflict and war over resources, water, crops, and land. There's going to be increased discrimination and geopolitical tensions. What we're seeing right now is really, excuse the pun, the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this. It's going to get much, much worse. And finally, democracy will be heavily strained. We're already seeing democracy being heavily strained, with more right groups now entering into the European Union this year, and it's going to continue as well if our politicians and leaders don't do enough to address this issue in a way that suits their narrative, as well as the narratives of people who understand why the far right kind of political agenda is not going to work. But eventually, everywhere will need a climate justice approach. And for those of you who don't know what climate justice is, it's basically the merging of two things. It sits at the center of the Venn diagram of the environmental crisis and social justice issues. It tries to take both and tackle them together because they both need to be tackled together. So climate justice it means caring for the needs of the most vulnerable people while we care for the needs of a vulnerable planet. The two go hand in hand, and we can't solve one without solving the other. And I want to draw your attention to this pan-European survey, and the survey was about what issues do young people care about the most. It was a survey of young people 15 to 35 years old across 23 European countries, and in total, over 22,000 surveys were completed. And I need to stress that this survey was conducted between the 29th of October and the 19th of November 2020. So it was in the midst of coronavirus pandemic lockdowns. Many of the young people who took this survey were physically in lockdown at the time. And the first question in the study aims to assess which of the following do you consider the most serious problems facing the world as a whole today? And even though many of those young people were in lockdown, they answered number 1, climate change, number 2, environmental degradation, and then the spread of infectious diseases. So you can see very clearly just how high on the priority list that climate-related issues are to young people. And then an eco-UNESCO study in Ireland conducted on over 1,000 young people on the topic of climate change and eco-anxiety found that 97% of young people feel concerned about climate change. 60% feel as though they have already been personally impacted by climate change. A third feel they do not have enough knowledge or skills to engage in climate actions. And finally, 84% of young people are already involved or want to be involved in climate actions. Eco-anxiety was one of the big things that was found to hold these young people back. They didn't feel that they were listened to, and they didn't know where to put this fear that they were feeling. So eco-anxiety is the chronic fear of environmental cataclysm that comes from observing the impacts of climate change and the associated concern for one's future and that of the next generations. And there's the emergence of solastalgia. I'm assuming you all know of the term nostalgia, wanting to go back to a place in your childhood or in your youth that you have great memories of and that you wish you could go back to have that same feeling. This feeling of solastalgia is the opposite, and we're seeing this new emergence of it in young people. It is the want to have a future that you know that you should be able to have, but that you will never have because of climate change. How incredibly upsetting is that? So we're now entering into this entire new concept in psychology all around this idea of solastalgia and eco-anxiety. But what is the, one more slide. It's not just our mental health that's affected, but also our physical health. So for those of you who haven't heard of the term planetary health, that looks at how the degrading health of our planet can also lead to the degrading health of our bodies. And here's just a few examples for you. We have found that by burning fossil fuels and creating smog in cities, we're finding more lung disease. We have found that the increased pesticides that we are using are giving rise to pesticide-resistant insects, which then can spread malaria and dengue fever. We are finding, and by the way, this was a study conducted in the UK and Australia, so it's definitely happening in Europe, that there are heavy metals found in our fruits and vegetables from nearby soil that is accumulating pollution from local lakes and rivers. And that causes chemical poisoning, such as cancer, tumours, and even miscarriages. We also have a huge increase of fish eating plastic in the ocean that resembles their food. There's a very scientific process behind this called bioaccumulation. I won't get into it, but basically if a fish or an aquatic species eats some plastic, the chemicals from that plastic actually move into the flesh of the fish. And spoiler alert, humans also bioaccumulate, so it means that if you eat that fish, you then also take on the toxins that are within its body. And that's leading to joint inflammation, neurotoxicity, and the unknown. We don't know, we haven't got the research long enough yet to understand what happens if humans keep eating plastic-based chemicals. But a study found that 75% of the 34 breast milk samples studied contained microplastics and potentially harmful plastic chemicals that were being directly from the mother's body through her breast milk, then into her newborn baby. So, of course, we're anxious. How could we not be? It's a very cyclical and holistic issue. But there is one cure that was found by researchers who looked at how to actually prevent and solve eco-anxiety and to remove those feelings in young people. And that cure was collective and meaningful action. So collective means not acting alone. It means acting with a group of people that have a similar mindset to you on these issues. And meaningful action means that you feel that it genuinely makes a large-scale difference. So through some interviews, they found out that they are collective power solutions, and the power here means taking back power for young people. So for example, consumer decisions. Where do we shop? What do we buy? Who do we boycott? Volunteer activism work, getting involved in the local and national level, and also what activism style suits you best. Some people are better artists and want to do artivism. Other people are better with their feet on the street and making loud and proud protests. Advocacy. What advocacy and policy campaigns do you support? How should we support them? Collective actions, working as a community to lobby and protest. And voting. Which candidates or causes do we support? So there are many different solutions to them. There's also a wonderful concept in Ireland about a Climate U delegate, and our Climate U delegate this year is called Beth Doherty, and she did a wonderful action where she sued the Irish government for being too vague on their climate actions, and she won. This was a collective thing that she did, but she was the face of the campaign, and now the Irish government, so it's a joint programme between the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications in collaboration with us in NYCI. We work together with Beth, and each year this appointed young person joins Ireland's official delegation to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and Beth will attend COP now alongside the Irish government to ensure that the youth voice is heard. Does your country have a Climate U delegate programme? And if not, that could be your first collective power action to advocate for one, so that we have more young people joining their delegations to then go to COP and have their voice heard outside of the youth protesting space, but actually within the chambers of COP itself. But youth voices have always been at the helm of the climate crisis. So we have young people on the boards who actually set up Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil. But what we're seeing is more and more how would you say, some people might call them rebellious protests from young people. At the moment, we kind of started with the protests of all of these signs. So you'll die of old age, we'll die of climate change. Which green do you see? The wrong Amazon is burning. I like that one. People, not profit. We are skipping our lessons to teach you one. And my favorite sign. Why should we go to school if you won't listen to the educated? Right? But now some of those posters have now actually gone more into actions apart from just protesting. So we're now seeing young people zip tie themselves to the goalposts of football games, throwing soup and potatoes on famous paintings, which you might have heard about, gluing ourselves to roads and strapping ourselves to railway lines. And this has caused a lot of anger, particularly with people who don't understand the meaning behind these protests. I get these protests. Number one, yes, our actions are inconvenient for you, but how much more inconvenient will the climate crisis be? And two, we revere the beauty of these paintings, protecting them behind glass, yet we can't revere and protect the beauty of our own planet. And actually, while I was on the way to this centre yesterday, I took a screenshot of a tweet, and it says, "Remember when the public raged at Just Stop Oil for blocking roads to try and alert the public to the magnitude of climate change? But this is the huge A2 motorway in Austria just outside of Vienna." And you can't see it from where you're sitting probably, but it is completely flooded. You know those massive signs that give you warnings, like if there's a slippery road up ahead? The floodwaters are halfway up those signposts. So it's an interesting one that they're right, even though we might not agree with some of their methods. They are trying to warn us in a particular way that grabs more attention. But what we found from these protests and from the anger that was generated by them, that a lot of disproportionate responses were being used to address these types of climate protests. So we have a lot of different media outlets here saying preventative detention under the convention, and this was the one that grabbed us the most. So I don't know if you're aware, but Germany very, very silently passed a law in both Berlin and Munich because they were the two biggest cities that young people were protesting in. They brought in a law where if police officials discovered that young people were planning a climate protest, they could then mark them as a criminal organization, and they could arrest and detain the young people who were planning that protest for up to 30 days through the date of the planned protest, and then release them after the protest was meant to have happened. So they kept this very quiet, but eventually, after the young people who were detained came out, it started to get word in the media, and the Council of Europe got wind of it. And this was brought then to the presidency, or not the presidency, sorry, the ministry in Iceland, and they decided that something had to be done about it. So I currently sit on a drafting committee for the Council of Europe on a recommendation for it's going to be brought to the Council of Ministers later on this year or in early 2025. It's already passed through the Council of Youth, but it's on young people and climate action. So this recommendation aims to protect young people and remove barriers to their participation in climate-related decision-making processes. It is the first time in history that a recommendation of this nature is needed. It focuses on both the climate and biodiversity crises, the right of peaceful assembly and protest for young people, and it also asks that consideration is given to the specific needs of all young people, especially those from marginalised, vulnerable or disadvantaged groups, including Indigenous youth and asylum seekers. It includes recommendations on providing tailored information for those who work in the courts and in law enforcement to better understand these new forms of protest. It also calls for the upskilling of youth workers in climate crisis information, training and funding so that they can then better support their local young activists. And the recommendation will hopefully be accepted by the Council of Ministers in early 2025. And then we're going to need all of your help to get the recommendation accepted by your government. This will be a huge collective action that we can all take and organise together. And when Bruno was doing the wonderful Mentimeter of what came out of or what do you want to come out of this 2.5-day session for you, I said networking groups so that we can all take collective action. And if we're all on board for it, this could be one of the first things that we do, is try to push that this recommendation is adopted by your own personal government. But finally, I don't know what the outcomes of this 2.5 days are going to be. But I'm really, really excited to get started with you all and see where it all takes us. And please don't be afraid to come up and start to network with anybody while you're here, because really building those bridges is what's going to get the work done. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to getting to know you all over the next few days.